In this lesson, we are going to continue working on our news administration page.
Okay.
In this video specifically, we are going to add the ability to edit existing records.
All right, cool.
If you remember in the last lesson, when we were creating the display portion,
Mm-hmm.
we set it up so that each link, or each headline was a link that gave an edit ID.
Right.
What we want to do is make it so that when these links are clicked, we reload our form, and instead of displaying a blank form,
mm-hmm.
we bring all of the data back into the form itself.
Right, so you can just go in there and start editing it.
Exactly. And then we'll need to set it up so that when submitted, this data is used to update an existing record instead of making a new one.
Okay, cool.
So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is make the script so that whenever a headline link is clicked,
mm-hmm.
it will reload this form.
Okay.
So let's jump over into source for a minute. If we go up to the top here, we do a check to see if the value or the variable add was passed via the get method. And if we look at the links used
mm-hmm.
for each of these, we jump over to the site itself, you can see that each of these links gives the edit ID at the bottom.
Right, okay.
So we want to check for that value as well. So we could say if we're looking for add or we're looking for edit ID. Edit ID was specified in those links. Then go ahead and show the form. So let's refresh this, and you can see already I clicked on one of these,
mm-hmm.
which had brought it up at the top. That does, in fact, bring the form up now.
I see.
So that's good, but we don't have any data yet.
Right.
Because all we've used this form for so far is just creating the data to begin with.
Right.
So let's take a look at what we need to do to populate all of these fields and set them up so that they contain all the data for that record. This means that we're going to need to run a query. So let's start on that query. I'm going to tab over, and we'll put together a MySQL query. We'll say that the query is going to be select star from news where auto ID is equal to whatever ID was specified.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll concatenate to the value held within the get variable, and we'll be accessing the edit ID key. So with that, we'll run the query, store it in $result. $result equals MySQL query. We're specify $query and $db link, like such. And I'm going to go ahead and also run the MySQL fetch associative and store this record in a variable to make it easier to access throughout the rest of the form. So we'll say $row is equal to MySQL fetch associative for $result. Now, unlike past examples where we would run this within a loop, we're just going to run it once or by itself, because
mm-hmm.
we're only looking at one record. Since we ran the query saying that we wanted to pull out information where auto ID was one specific number,
right.
It's only going to return one record. So now with our $row, we can begin using that to populate the fields. So let's see what happens if we go to our first field where we have the field called header. To specify that this field has information in it, we can give it the value property. So we'll say value equals some value. And then I'm going to break into the PHP tags here,
right.
so that we can paste $row. And I'm going to say that, in this case, we're looking for header, like such.
Mm-hmm.
So let's save that out and see how it's working. If we simply go and navigate to this page again,
right.
you can see it's pulling out the information for ID 10.
All right,
so
cool.
it is in fact working. Now, since we've been working so much inside of the actual form, we need to make sure that this can still act as our entry form. So what happens if we were to go back and simply say add new item?
Oh, wow. What happened?
So we've got a MySQL warning here. Here's the problem. We're running this query under both cases, for adding or editing, because we wanted access to this form.
Right.
Here's the thing, though. We need to set up our code so that this query is only ran in edit mode, as it causes problems in add mode. Since we're not specifying a record, we're trying to create a new one.
That's right. Okay.
So we need to make sure that we only run this query if we are in edit mode. So actually, I'll just copy all of this. So if we are in edit mode, then run all of this. And if we do that, that seems like that should work.
Right.
And look at that. It looks like we still have some kind of problem. We have a little weird bit of information thrown in header. Let's see exactly what that is. If we were to view the source for this page and scroll down to that edit box, check it out. This is what it did. Inside of value, the errors in PHP are HTML formatted. So through the first line return, and then some more information which we didn't see in the box. So we still have undefined variable row. The problem here is now we have all the queries run properly, only in edit mode. But that means that $row is undefined if we aren't in edit mode, which again causes problems for adding. So we're not going to be able to directly use row. We're going to need to put in our own variables that we have set up ahead of time. So I'm going to remove this and replace it with $header. Much like when we were working with the data input up at the top of the script, when we had to go and pre-process some values instead of just using the values directly from the array.
Right.
Kind of a similar type thing here. So what we need to do is we're going to, instead of rely on $row, we're going to make up our own set of variables. The first one being $header. And before we run all the queries, I'm just going to have them set to blank. Basically, we're going to set up the defaults. As a matter of fact, we could even put a comment and say set default values. So this way, we make sure that we have a variable that is defined in all cases, and then only fill that if we need to fill in the data from the database. So in the case of being in the edit section, or in edit mode, we could say that $header is equal to $row header like such. And this way, let's run it and see what we get. So in the case of add, works fine. There's nothing messing up the form.
Right.
If we go back and grab one of the items, we see it does in fact load. And we get around any form of error or warning in either case.
All right, cool.
So we have this all set up. Just a simple matter of being very careful about what variables we have depending on whether we're in add or edit mode. So now we can simply fill in the rest of the values for the other fields. To begin with, let's see. Let's set up the rest of our defaults and load the rest of our values from here. So we have header. We'll need headline, news, and we'll also need featured and active.
Right.
So 2 more. All right. So we've got headline, the news itself, active and featured, which I'll, just for clarity's sake.
I see. Well, you have 2 headers now.
Oh yeah, header, featured.
Yeah.
Like so.
Yeah, there you go.
And then the same here. We'll load all of those values out into their respective variables.
Once again, header, headline, news, featured, and active.
So, news, and featured, and active.
Active.
So we have all of our default values.
Right.
We have the ability to load data information from the database into these values.
Right.
Now we just need to take each of these and place them throughout the form itself. If you saw just a second ago, we created the value property. We can actually go out from layout and assign these. You can see that if we click on one of these fields,
right,
we see it fills in these tags as the value. So we could do the same thing for headline. Replace it with $headline. Now something interesting happens if we try to do this for the text area.
Okay.
Because of the way it handles its information in the content section, this will actually cause a bit of a problem if we look back over in source. If we scroll over, you can see it's put in the characters to represent a less than and greater than sign, whereas we need the actual signs for PHP tags. So I'll simply go in and replace these. Because otherwise what that would show is when we run the script is we actually see these in the final field as opposed to the real content.
It would actually show your actual code in there.
That's right.
Okay.
So news. That brings us to the checkboxes.
Featured and active.
So we need to take a look at the information that's held within a checkbox itself. The first is, since it's not really holding information, it's only holding a state. It's either selected or unselected.
Right.
So how is that stored? Let's look at the source for one, and we can see that we have 3 properties for it at the moment: type, name, and value. So what happens if one of these was to be selected? Well, let's hit select over in the inspector, then check the source, and you can see that that added a checked property and set it to checked. So this is what we need to do to affect a checkbox and make it checked, which means we'll need to do a little bit more processing up in this section, where if we just load featured and active, we're going to have a 1 or a 0, which won't work. We need the checked property to be set.
Alright, so it won't be actually checking the true-false statement?
In the case of a checkbox, it'll be checking it, but that's the problem, is that 1 and 0 do not affect a checkbox. 1 and 0 don't make it checked or unchecked. We literally need to have the property checked, or the lack of the property to make it unchecked.
Okay.
So here's what we're going to do. We have the value, a 1 or a 0, but we're going to need to check that and convert it into checked or blank.
I gotcha. Okay.
So we can say if $row featured is equal to 1,
meaning true,
then featured equals whatever it is in code that we need to make these checked, which is, we'll just copy this checked property out, move it out of the way, and paste it up here. So say featured equals this. Of course, this needs to be in quotes because it is a string.
Right.
Also, I'm going to put a space in front of this just to keep everything spaced off nicely from the rest of the properties. So then we'll close that, and we need an else statement here. Oh, actually, thinking about it, do we really need the else? We already have a default value for it, which is blank. So therefore, we don't need an else at all.
Oh, okay, cool.
We can just say if this product is featured, go ahead and throw the necessary HTML to make it checked. Otherwise, it is completely blank. And like we were talking about a second ago, when a checkbox is unselected, it simply omits the checked property.
So okay, that totally makes sense. That you won't even need to type it out, save you some time.
Exactly. So same thing here. We'll copy that, except this becomes active and active, like such. So the only thing left is to take these variables and put them in place over here. So we'll say throw all this into place. Now, if you remember, we have that space at the front of the string, which is where I'm going to take text jumping around. Take this space out and delete it. So that way, if it is set, then we'll have the space put back in. Otherwise, it'll be back to the way it was.
Okay.
So we can put $featured, and then we need to do the same for the other checkbox, which was the one up above. So actually, this is going to be active. Really, I think when this thing jumped, it went down to the submit input, so it actually jumped a little all over the place. So we'll patch this up real quick. So what we were interested in was the checkbox itself. So featured value equals 1. Actually, like such. Alright, so that should take care of our featured box. Now we just need to do the same thing for active. Like such. So with that, let's try it out. Simply go navigate to this page again, and there we go. We have headline loaded. News, it's possible that this item just doesn't have any news set for it.
Yeah, more than likely.
And featured and active have been set. So if we go back, let's grab one of these. So check it out.
And there you go.
Now we're loading all the information, active and checked, shown once again.
Cool.
Now
yeah, as I say, featured and active, little asterisk up there.
Yeah, well, now we don't have any that aren't, so it's a little tricky to show at the moment. We could add a new one that doesn't have any, so we'll say no checkboxes, or I'll like such. So none of those checked. Now if we go back and load it, we can see that that is in fact working properly.
Right, and so now if you check it and you hit submit again,
Well, this will bring up an interesting problem now.
Okay.
So it looks like it's working so far. We have
You should just have to hit submit, and it just goes back and puts all your new stuff in there.
Now here's the problem. Check it out.
Oh, it just made a duplicate of the same one you just did.
Exactly, because if you think about it, we're using the same form. The only thing we've done to this form is made it so that it's able to load data from somewhere else where you don't have to type it in. Everything else about it, including the actual query code, is set up to insert a new record.
Oh, so it thinks that you're typing a whole new news article in.
Yeah, as far as it's concerned, then this is an entirely new news item.
Okay.
So, that brings us to the next thing we need to do. We need to have our query section set up so that it can tell the difference, and then edit if we're in edit mode, or add the new record if we're in add mode.
Okay.
Now, in order to make it so that we can tell, well, we not only need to tell the difference, but once we submit, we need something that will actually tell the script what item this is. Because from all of these fields, we don't have an ID number to a specific record. We can't look up a record to edit, because once we hit submit, now it's a whole new page, and we have to preserve that auto ID. So we're actually going to need to put in a hidden input within the form itself. So let's take a look at this now. Here we have our form, so I'm going to create a line below that, and we're going to create a hidden input within the form. So we'll say input type equals hidden, name equals, we'll call this input item ID. So that's what we'll be checking after this is submitted.
Okay.
And we'll set its value to equal, once again we'll set this up to where we have a variable that we set beforehand. We'll call that variable dollar, how about dollar item ID? Like such.
Okay.
Now this of course means we need to set up a default value for when we're in add mode, and set it when we're in edit mode. So the default for this, we'll say that it will default to 0. This way when we check and we have an item ID of 0, we'll assume that we're adding.
Okay.
And if we have an item ID that has an actual number in it, then we'll assume that we're in edit mode, and that we should use that number to look up a news item by ID.
Okay, cool.
So all of our information should be loaded into the $row array here, so we should be able to access auto ID, like such. Now let's verify that our hidden item ID is in fact working. So here we have ID 11.
Right.
If we look at the page's source, find that form, then find our hidden input, the value is 11. So far so good.
Cool.
And if we're adding a new item, and we look in source, the value is 0.
All right.
So now we have something that we can work with when we're actually submitting this data. So now it is time to go and modify the query section of the code to handle that. So where do we need to start? We need to leave, there's a lot of this that we can reuse. As a matter of fact, almost all of it. So what are we checking? We're checking to see if we're submitting. Well, we still need to check that in both cases. We're going to be submitting from the form.
Right.
We have our featured and active processing. Well, we're still going to need to do that. Whether we're adding a new record or editing, this is the same data that we'll be using. And the same with these. We still want to leave our quote replacement code. So really, it's right before the query that we want to perform our check on item ID. So we can say if $post item ID, and we'll say if it is greater than 0, then we are in edit mode.
Right.
Because we have an actual item to work with. Otherwise, we are in add mode. And we'll take this query and leave it as is. And I'm also going to take this and tab it over to keep it nicely formatted.
Clean it up a little bit.
So we'll say add new record. Or if we're editing, update existing record. Exiting record.
As a stinging.
Just update record.
3 tries, then you just got it.
Yeah, we gotta get back to coding. So here's our query for add, and I can actually use that as the basis for our update query. So we're going to change this around such that it says update news, and we want to set some values. We're going to completely take this section out and modify this. As a matter of fact, we don't need to specify the fields. We'll do when we get to here. So we'll say that we will set header to equal $header, and the same for the rest of them. Headline equals headline, news equals news, featured is featured,
and active is active.
Now, we don't want to leave this as is because we've taken out anything to specify what record specifically. If we run this by itself, then we're going to update all records to hold this information.
Okay.
So that would cause the moment we edit, all of our records are then the same thing.
That's right. Go back to the ed example we used.
Exactly. So we need to specify a where clause. So we'll say where auto ID is equal to this post ID. Now with that now, update news, that looks like it should work. Though before I test this and we risk modifying any of the data, I want to echo out this query, and that way we can preview exactly what it's going to do.
Okay.
So I'll echo $query and exit. Halt execution of the script right here. And looking at this, I need a closing parenthesis here to match that one, so we have our if statement put together, and that should be good. So let's take a look now. If we go to edit mode, so we're in edit mode, we'll say just -ed and submit. We'll say update news, so no actual errors. This is what...
Good. You got the echo out.
So update news, so header looks good, headline, so on, and where auto ID is 12.
Cool.
So that looks fine. We'll remove our debug information and try it out. So -ed, submit. Check it out.
Alright, sweet.
So we know that works. Let's try the header. And added news. Now let's swap these checkboxes.
And look at that.
So there we go.
Alright, cool.
So everything is working.
Everything's working properly. You can update it now, edit it out.
So yeah, that's...
And it's not creating the same one over and over again, so we've done well.
So yeah, we have the ability to edit items from our news administration page. And that is all we wanted to cover in this lesson. Once again, we simply took a look at revisiting the existing form that we had, setting it up so that that form would show when we were in edit mode.
Okay.
Then running a query so that we could load the information for that record and load all the data back into our edit fields.
Right.
Then we took a look at storing a hidden ID within the form, which could later be used in the queries to tell the difference between edit mode and add mode,
right,
and run the appropriate query. So with that, that is going to wrap this lesson.